Hey, welcome to Draft Academy. My name's Mike. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about data types in PHP. Now in PHP, we're going to be working with all different types of information, and as we go forward in the course and we start writing more and more complex programs, we're going to be dealing with all different types of information and data. So in this tutorial, I just kind of want to talk to you guys about the different types of data that we can work with and represent inside of our PHP programs. And it's actually pretty simple. So down here in these little PHP tags, I'm actually just going to be creating a couple different variables, and we'll be storing different types of data inside of those variables. So the first type of data that we can work with and represent in PHP is what's called a string. And a string is basically just plain text. So anytime in PHP where we want to work with plain text, whether it's like a name or it could be like a location or a line in a book or anything that is plain text, we can use a string. So I'm going to create a variable over here. We'll just call it like phrase. And whenever I want to create a string, I'm always going to put an open and close quotation mark. So anytime that we're writing out a string or we're working with a string, it's going to basically just be text inside of these open and close quotation marks. And anytime you have the quotation marks there, PHP is going to know like, hey, this is going to be a string. So I could just put a phrase like to be or not to be. Right, so this is just any text that I want to store or work with or represent in my program can be a string like this. In addition to plain text, we can also represent numbers. And there's two basic types of numbers in PHP. There's whole numbers and then there's decimal numbers. And PHP has special names for these. The first is going to be an integer. So an integer is basically going to be a whole number. And so those are just like counting numbers, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's essentially just a number without a decimal point. So if I was to store someone's age inside of a variable, I can make this a number. And with numbers, all you have to do is just type out the number. So let's say someone was like 30 years old. I can just type out 30 here. I don't need quotation marks. I can just put the number here. And with numbers in PHP, you can also make them negative. So I can make this a negative number. But you'll notice here, this number doesn't have a decimal point. So there's no decimal point, with like a bunch of numbers after it. It's just a whole number. And this is what we would refer to as an integer. And it's important to know the difference between decimal numbers and integers because PHP is actually going to distinguish between them. So just know that anytime you have a number without a decimal point, it's an integer. We can also use a decimal number. Sometimes people will call these floating point numbers, or they'll just call them like floats. And these are pretty straightforward. It's any number with a decimal point. So maybe we could store someone's GPA. So let's say their GPA was like a 3.7, right? Or it could even be like a 3.0 or 2.98743, basically any decimal number that you want to work with and represent in PHP. And this is, like I said, it's a lot of people will call these like floating point numbers or decimal numbers, but it is important to distinguish between these two. So there's a big difference in PHP between 30 and 30.0. There is going to be a difference between the two of those. This one obviously being a decimal. All right, so there's one more data type, one more main data type that we can work with and sort of represent in PHP, which is called a Boolean. And a Boolean is basically a true or a false value. So this is probably a little bit less intuitive than these guys over here, like text and numbers. That's pretty obvious. But a lot of times when we're programming, we're going to want to represent and work with true or false data. So we're going to want to be able to store like true or false information, and we can store that in something called a Boolean. So I'm going to create a Boolean variable, and why don't we call this like is male? So this variable could tell us whether or not someone's a male. And I could either set this equal to true if they're a male, or I could set this equal to false. So anytime we have a Boolean variable, or anytime you're representing a Boolean value, it can only be one of two things, either true or false. It's like a binary data type. And this is going to come in handy a lot in PHP, and we'll kind of get into how Booleans are useful more later in the course. But for now, just know that you can store a true or a false value inside of a Boolean. So there's one more data type. I guess it's kind of a data type. It's basically a value that you'll see sometimes in PHP, and it's the null value. So anytime you see null like this in PHP, this basically stands for no value. And a lot of times in PHP, we're going to kind of go out of our way to say something has no value. So sometimes you'll see like maybe an error message, or you'll try to print something out and it'll basically just say null. And that's because it has no value. So anytime something has no value, PHP will denote that using this null keyword. So these are really the basic data types. And as we go through this course, and really as you go through your PHP journey, I'd say 99% of the time, you're just gonna be using these data types. So you're just gonna be representing information in the form of text, numbers, or Booleans. And really with just this information, you can, essentially build any program that you want. And I also do just want to point out that, we don't always have to store this information inside of variables. So if I was to come down here, I could just echo out like a string. So over here, I'm printing out a string onto the browser. So over here, it says like hello, right? I could do the same thing for a number. So I could just put a number down here like 4.57, and it's going to be the same thing. So, you don't always have to store these things in variables. Although if you wanted, we could, I could print out like this phrase variable, and this is going to get printed out onto the screen as well. So that's kind of the basics of, different data types in PHP. And really, these are data types that you're going to be seeing as we go forward in the course. So I just wanted to kind of give you guys an introduction into what they were and how we can use them. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe to Draft Academy to be the first to know when we release new content. Also, we're always looking to improve, so if you have any constructive criticism or questions or anything, leave a comment below. Finally, if you're enjoying Draft Academy and you want to help us grow, head over to draftacademy.com/contribute and invest in our future.